In this video, I'm going to be going over how to solve quadratic equations by factoring. So before you get into this one, make sure you are pretty confident in your factoring ability, whether based off of what you learned last year or what you saw in class, or by going back and rewatching a couple of previous videos, like the 4.2.0 videos, just to brush up on your factoring skills so that you'll be able to do the rest of this. Because you'll see pretty quickly that most of what this lesson involves is really just factoring. The solving part is pretty basic. So let's get into the lesson, see what we got. Let's start off with some basics though, something that doesn't actually even need any factoring. So imagine you were asked to solve the equation 2x equals 0. Well, that's pretty easy to do. We want to solve for x, which means you need to get rid of that 2. So we can just divide both sides by 2, right? And so that gets me, well, x equals 0. Pretty straightforward. I could do the same thing maybe with a y. So if I asked you to solve, I don't know, negative 6y equals 0. All right, you can divide both sides by negative 6 this time, and that's still going to get you y equals 0. Right, so if you want to get 0 from multiplying with something, you kind of need to have a 0 in there. If we make it a little bit more complex, if I asked you to solve, say, 2 times x plus 1 equals 0 now. There's a couple of different ways you could approach this, but the process is basically going to be the same, that you're going to want to get rid of that 2, so we can divide both sides by 2, which is going to get you x plus 1 equals 0. And then from there, well, now we just need to solve this, so we'd say, all right, I want to move that 1. I'm going to subtract 1 on both sides, and I find out that x is negative 1. No big deal. Pretty straightforward. So let's extend that a little bit further and say I asked you to solve x times y equals 0. And now we got to think a little bit. So here's the deal. If you're multiplying two things and you're getting 0 from them, what does that tell you about your things? Well, if we put a little bit of logic into stuff, the main takeaway from this lesson really comes down to one thing. If you multiply two numbers, or two things in general, and you get 0, that tells you really that one of those two things has to be 0. So if x times y is 0, then either x equals 0, or y equals 0, or both. Because the only way to get 0 when you're multiplying is to multiply by 0. And so let's extend this into more complicated polynomials. So if I ask you to solve something like x minus 5 times x plus 8 equals 0, which you'll notice is basically what we'd get after we factored something. So the only way to get 0 out of this, because we're multiplying two things, right? We're multiplying x minus 5 times x plus 8. So let's imagine those are basically like an a and a b, something times something. Well, if this is going to get you 0, then either the first thing has to be 0 or the second thing has to be 0. So either x minus 5 equals 0 or x plus 8 equals 0. And so now we just solve those two things. Right, we've basically got two little mini equations. So x minus 5 equals 0, if I want to solve that, I'm going to add 5 to both sides, which gets me x equals 5. And then I have x plus 8 equals 0, so I'm going to subtract 8 on both sides. And that gets me that x is negative 8. And there we go, that's it. We have solved. So these would be the two solutions to my original equation. And we can even show that this works. If we go back to the original thing we started with, so x minus 5 times x plus 8, if you put, say, 5 in for x, right, so we have 5 minus 5, and then 5 plus 8, well, 5 plus 8 is 13, that's fine, but 5 minus 5 is 0. and 0 times 13 is 0. And you'd see the exact same thing if you put negative 8 in. You'd get negative 13 and then a 0 again. And so if we try this again, say we wanted to solve x plus 7 times x minus 20 equals 0, I basically just take this and I say, all right, well, this means either my first thing, x plus 7, has to be 0, or my second thing, x minus 20, has to equal 0. And then we solve those two things. So you're going to either subtract or add, depending on what you're dealing with. So the first one, we're going to subtract 7. The second one, we're going to add 20. And so we end up with our solutions of x equals negative 7 or x equals positive 20. And if you understood that, if you understood those last two examples, you're basically set for the rest of this little lesson, because the solving part isn't really going to change much. The factoring is going to get harder, but hopefully you already know how to factor, so that won't really matter too much. So let's say I asked you to solve one that wasn't already factored. So x squared minus 3x minus 4 equals 0. So step 1 is a large step. Step 1 is to factor in whatever way is appropriate for what you need to do. So whether that's common factors, whether that's just basic breaking something down, whether that's the harder factoring with an a value, whether it's a difference of squares, right? Whatever you have to do to get this thing as factored as you can. So in this case, if I'm looking at this, x squared minus 3x minus 4 equals 0, there are no common factors. This isn't a difference of squares, but there isn't an a value out front. So I don't have to worry about doing any of the harder stuff you would have seen in the second factoring video if you watched those. So in this case, I just need to find two numbers that multiply to c, add to b. So what multiplies to negative 4 adds to negative 3. There's not very many options for multiplying to 4. It's either 1 and 4 or 2 and 2. In this case, it is going to be negative 4 and positive 1. So we end up with x minus 4 and then x plus 1 equals 0. And so now you'll notice we're basically just in the same place we were on the last few examples. So your second step here, once you have factored, is to do what we did, and you set each factor, so x minus 4 or x plus 1, equal to 0, and then you solve. So we've got x minus 4 equals 0, and x plus 1 equals 0, which leaves me with x equals positive 4, or x equals negative 1. All right, so we do another one. Feel free to give this one a shot on your own. So you should have all the processes that you need, right? You're going to factor and then you're going to solve. So give this one a shot. Pause the video for 30 seconds and come back and see how you did. All right, so if we're solving this one, we're finding two things that multiply to 12 and add to negative 7. That means we need two negative numbers, right? Because we're multiplying to a positive but adding to a negative. In this case, it's going to be x minus 3 and x minus 4 equals 0. In this video, by the way, I'm not really going to go through and explaining all the details of the factoring. So if you're not getting the factoring, do go back to those videos just to speed things along. I'm going to skip past most of that. All right, so I've factored this one. I break it up. I've got x minus 3 equals 0 and x minus 4 equals 0, which tells me that x is either positive 3 or positive 4, right? Because I have added 3 to both sides and added 4 to both sides. Making things a little bit harder. If we have 2x squared minus 4x minus 96, those are big numbers. So remember, the first thing you want to do anytime you see a number out front, really the first thing you want to do on any question, period, is to check for common factors. There won't always be one, but if there is, it's almost always going to make your life a lot easier to take it out. I'd say it will always make it easier, actually, not almost. So in this case, if we look at 2, 4, and 96, we are going to be able to take out a 2, which is going to leave me with x squared minus 2x minus 48 equals 0. And that is going to be a lot easier to factor because we don't have to worry about an a value anymore. So multiplying to negative 48, adding to negative 2, that is going to be negative 8 and positive 6. And so here's the thing. If I told you you had 3 things that were being multiplied, so 2 times a times b equals 0, it still comes down to either a or b has to be 0, because 2 isn't 0. 2 is never going to be 0, it's just 2. But you still need to be multiplying by 0 somewhere in here, so it still really comes down to one of these 2 things is going to be 0. So this 2 out front doesn't affect your solution. But only because it's just a 2. If it was an x or something, that would be a little bit different. So if we break this up, we've got x minus 8 equals 0, and x plus 6 equals 0, which gets me that x is either 8 or negative 6. And you can write your answers together like that if you want, nice and concise. Okay. So looking at this one, it's the same idea. You should be checking for common factors, and if you ever see a cube, ever, you should immediately look for common factors, because you don't know how to factor things with cubes in them. Those aren't quadratic anymore, those are cubic, and that goes beyond this course. So in this case, all 3 of our terms have an x, so we are going to take out an x. It's going to leave me behind x squared plus 5x plus 6 equals 0. You're going to want to factor the 5x and 6. It's going to get you x times x plus 3 times x plus 2 equals 0. And so that common factor we got to think about now. So now it's not 2 times a times b, it's a times b times c equals 0. So we're multiplying 3 things. All of them have variables. All of them could be 0. And so the logic and the principle is exactly the same. If you're multiplying 3 things and getting 0, one of those 3 things has got to be 0. So our solutions, we've got x could be negative 3, right, from the x plus 3. X could be negative 2 from the x plus 2. But then we also have, from this right here, it's just an x. So if you ever have an x that's by itself, it's actually just going to give you a solution of 0. Because if you put a 0 in the front there, that is going to be 0 times some other stuff. So there we go. We've got 3 solutions here. Okay, continuing on, making things a little bit tougher. So we want to solve, let's say 3x squared plus 8x plus 4 equals 0. Not much different here. It is just one of those ones where we have an a value out front, and in this case, it is not something we can take out with a common factor, right? So you're not going to be able to take out anything from 3, 8, and 4. So remember, you want to find 2 things that multiply not just to 4, but now you got to deal with 3 and 4. So we want to multiply to 12 and add to 8, which, I mean, multiplying to 12, you've got only a few options. In this case, it's going to be 6 and 2, because 6 plus 2 does get us the 8 that we want. Remember, you want to take that middle term, that 8x, and break it up into 2 separate terms. So it's going to become 3x squared plus 6x plus 2x plus 4. And then from there, we make some groups of our first 2 terms and our last 2 terms. Don't forget your equals 0, by the way. This is an equation, right? So it is pretty common for people to get lazy and to drop half of their equation. And a lot of the times that leads to them not actually finishing. They'll factor, they'll forget that they were supposed to solve, and then they'll just kind of give up on the question. So always write down the other half of what you're dealing with. Let's take out some common factors. From 3x squared and 6x, we can take out a 3x. It leaves behind an x plus 2. From 2x and 4, we can take out a 2, which also leaves behind an x plus 2. And if we take out that repeated x plus 2 factor, we end up with 3x plus 2 equals 0. And so if we break these up, we get x plus 2 equals 0 and 3x plus 2 equals 0, right? So remember, set up each individual factor equal to 0. And once again, we solve. So the one on the left is going to get us x equals negative 2. That's pretty straightforward. The one on the right, we've got to do a little bit more work now because there's a 3 and a 2 to deal with. So remember, when you're solving, you want to get rid of the 2 first. You're going backwards. I tell my classes a lot of times that we're calling it SAM-DEB instead of BEDMAS because you're going in the opposite of the order of operations. So we want to subtract 2 from the start here. That's going to leave me with 3x equals -2. And then we're going to get rid of that 3 by dividing. So we end up with x is -2 over 3. And so those are my solutions. All right, one last one of these for you to try on your own. So you're going to solve 6x squared plus 13x plus 5 equals 0. So run through the whole process. You should end up, I'll tell you right now, with a couple of fractions as your answers. So if you get there, know what you're getting into. Pause the video for a sec, come back once you're done, and let's see how you did. So if we want to multiply to 30 and add to 13, that's going to be 3 and 10. So I'm going to go 6x squared plus 3x plus 10x plus 5. From those first 2 terms, I can take out a 3x, which is going to leave me with a 2x plus 1. And then from the last 2 terms, I can take out a 5, which is also going to get me that 2x plus 1. If you pull out that repeated factor of 2x plus 1, you're left with 3x plus 5. So there we go, we factored. And so you'll notice, really, the factoring is by far the most part of this as far as work goes. The solving part, the chapter 4 stuff versus the grade 10 stuff, really isn't that much harder. So we're going to break this up into our 2 factors. We've got 2x plus 1 equals 0 and 3x plus 5 equals 0. So we want to solve these. We're going to start by subtracting 1 in the first equation or subtracting 5 in the second equation, which gets me 2x equals -1 and 3x equals -5. And then we're going to divide for both of these. And so we'll get our final 2 solutions of x is -1 over 2 or -5 over 3. And there you go. That is the first bit of solving by factoring. There is one more video that I'm going to do for these that will go a little more in depth into some specific situations, like what happens if it doesn't equal 0, or what if there's more complicated things involved. But by and large, the process isn't going to change too much. So go take a look at that video once you're done with this one and get a little bit more practice.